So this is the Absent Voter Counting Board training for Eaton County. We've got this one this evening. There's another one Thursday morning. So if you have any trouble hearing or seeing anything this morning, you can, or this evening, you can try on Thursday morning and see if that's any better. So getting started, I want to just cover some basic items about, elections and your role as an election inspector. The reason we're there is to preserve the voting process, to ensure the privacy of the vote, and to ensure the security of the ballots. That's the main reason we're there, other than, obviously to conduct the election itself. So we just have to keep a focus on why we're there, that we're not there to necessarily make everybody happy with maybe the environment they find themselves in, especially during COVID. That's our job, is not to make the experience what they want it to be. We're there to make the experience as secure and private and have integrity. That's our focus. So I want to address just a few things about general voting system security. There's been a lot of talk in the news lately about elections, the security of our vote, ballots, all that kind of stuff. So I just wanted everybody to know some information that you hopefully can pass on to your friends and family if you do hear people talking about it. Our elections in Michigan especially are very secure. Our tabulating equipment is never connected to the internet. In order for someone to hack into our tabulating equipment, they would have to have physical access to it. It is connected to a cellular network at the end of the day to transmit results, but not before the election and not certainly during the election on election day. So the idea of hacked tabulating equipment is pretty minimal, if non-existent. The laptops that are used in the polls, these won't be in the AV board necessarily, but in the polls, those are connected to the internet before election day, but for security purposes, to make sure they don't have viruses on them, and to make sure they don't have software that could infringe on the election. And once that test has been completed, then they're disconnected and the voter database is installed. And at that point, they are never connected to the internet again until the election is done, the voter database is uploaded, and the election's over. And then we uninstall it. And before the next election, we connect them again to do that same test and sweep. So again, if someone wanted to hack into those laptops, they would have to have physical access to them, not remote access. And so in Michigan especially, the security of our paper ballot system allows us to conduct elections on election day if needed, and certainly after for recounts, without relying on the equipment. So if something did happen, we can still conduct our elections. We can still give people ballots, they can still vote, we can still count them. It would take a lot longer, but we can do it, and our elections would still be recountable and secure. So we use technology, but we do not rely on technology for our elections. So under Michigan election law, candidates and proposals can ask for recounts. And in order for a precinct to be recountable, the ballots must be sealed properly in a ballot container after the election, and the precinct must balance. That means the number of voters that were given a ballot must equal the number of ballots that were tabulated in that machine or by hand, depending on how the day went, at the end of the day. If those two numbers aren't the same, that renders the precinct uncountable, and we can't rely on that precinct for a recount. So of all the things that we're going to be talking about tonight, the two most important things at the end of the day are to seal the ballots properly and to make sure that the precinct balances, that voters did not leave with a ballot that every voter received one ballot, that it was properly inserted into the tabulator, so that precinct is recountable. There's some other things for the AV board specifically. We'll talk about those later, as far as balancing your precinct and how that can go wrong. Much easier than in a precinct. So for 2020, those of you who haven't done an election in 2020, there are some changes that will affect the AV boards, especially and as well as the precincts. The automatic registration at Secretary of State offices, it is now an opt-out system instead of an opt-in. You do not have to request to be registered. You are automatically registered unless you request not to be. So that will increase the number of registrations in Michigan. The second item is the no reason absent voting. Everyone's well aware of that. So we have anyone can vote by mail. There's no limit, no reason. You just apply for it, and if we can verify you are who you say you are, then we will give you a ballot. The registration deadline has been eliminated. There's no more 30-day deadline. People can register on election day and any day before that. And that will also impact the AV board specifically. We'll talk about that a little later as well. So the registration deadline, there is a soft registration deadline. After the 15th day, they have to register at the local clerk's office. Before that, they can pretty much register anywhere. But after that 15th day, the 14th day and sooner, they do have to go specifically to their local clerk. So let's see. As far as election security, for the AV board especially, there's some tasks that Michigan election law requires be completed by 2 inspectors of different political parties. Now, it used to be that we said by inspectors, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican. But Michigan has more than just the 2 parties that it recognizes. So they just have to be different political parties. And your chair and your clerk will know who has registered under what political party. So the absent voter counting board chair will be able to determine who can complete those tasks together. The first one is duplicating ballots. Generally speaking, it's not a task that is cumbersome. However, in August, it may be because the voters are receiving 1 ballot with 2 parties, and they cannot split their ticket. They can't vote for both parties. So not knowing that at the time they vote, that you may receive quite a few ballots where the voter has voted for both political parties. And so you may have to duplicate ballots, removing those errors when and if possible. And other times you may just have to force the machine to accept it, and it will count what it can count, and it will ignore what it has to ignore. The second task is feeding the ballots into the tabulator on election day. It cannot be just 1 person standing at the tabulator feeding those ballots. There must be 2 people of different political parties actually feeding the ballots into the tabulator. At the end of the day, sealing the ballot containers and the election materials, that has to be done by 2 inspectors, different parties, and delivering those results to the receiving board also has to be done by 2 different inspectors of different parties. This is something that I have to cover, but it may or probably would not impact an absent voter counting board, although it has in my jurisdiction. There are people who can come into the absent voter counting board room and watch and also challenge what you're doing. It's 2 different people. They can't be both at the same time. But if they do, they cannot leave. So the clerk and the chair need to make them aware of that before they go into the room. If they are expecting to only be there for a couple of hours and then go home, that is not an option. It's not like the polls, the precinct, where they can come and go. Once anyone enters that absent voter counting board room, other than the local clerk or state election official or county election official, they can't leave. So the workers can't leave, poll watchers cannot leave, challengers cannot leave. Once you're there for the entire day. So if you do have a poll watcher or a challenger that comes to you and wants to observe the absent voter counting board, it's very important to let them know they are welcome to do so. They have the right to do that. But if they go in, they cannot leave. They can't leave for lunch. They can't leave for dinner. They have to stay the entire time. And no one else can bring them food unless that person is also willing to stay in the room for the remainder of the day. So it's unlikely that you would get someone that would be willing to do that. But like I said, it has happened. So if it does, your local clerk will be up to speed on what they can do, what they cannot do. And I'm sure we'll cover that with you. We'll go over it very shortly. Poll watchers, basically speaking, cannot interact with you at all. They are watching only. They cannot be behind the tables where you're working. They cannot look at any of the things that you're doing unless the chair feels that it is not intrusive. Then you can allow it. But they are not allowed to interact with you at all. And you have the right as the chair to remove them if they do. Now, I wouldn't do it without contacting your clerk because I'm sure the Bureau would have some process to follow to deal with that since they're not really supposed to leave. But if they're being intrusive, then somehow that has to be dealt with. Challengers, on the other hand, do have the right to be right up next to you. They can observe what's going on, they can watch, they can look at the materials, but they still can't interact unless they are going to challenge. They can't just chit chat, they can't just talk, ask you questions, what are you doing, all that kind of thing. The only time they can talk is to challenge either what you're doing, the process you're following, or when you're opening the ballots, they can challenge someone's right to vote and have their vote counted. So they neither can use electronic devices in the precinct. They can use an iPad to sort of make notes and things, but they cannot use a cell phone. They cannot use their iPad to connect to the internet or anything like that. Built-in cameras can't be used. And that would be a reason also to contact your clerk or the Bureau to have them removed or somehow dealt with if they are violating that. Also, something that I have to cover but doesn't really impact the AV board specifically, but if someone is in the room, a poll watcher or a challenger, they can't have any campaign material on them. Even though there's no voters in there, it's still a precinct, and it can't have anything there about campaign materials, petition signatures, any stickers or hats or anything on their person. It's just like the precinct. So we can open it up to just general questions on that before we get down into the nitty-gritty of the AV board itself. If anyone has any questions, I don't see any hands going up, so that's a good sign. We'll keep going. So the absent voter counting board is basically a precinct that is just for counting AV ballots on election day. It is considered a precinct. It just doesn't have voters. You're just counting ballots that have been cast prior in the mail. But it is considered an official precinct. So it has to be established by either the township board or the election commission of the jurisdiction, depending on how your charter's set up. We do have one question. Let's see here. Trying to unmute them so they can talk. Go ahead, Linda. What's your question?
I'm sorry, I forgot we could raise our hand.
That's okay.
The duplicating ballots, I'm a little, I don't quite understand that.
I'll go into a lot more specifics on that later.
Okay, sounds great.
Yeah, yep, okay. Okay, so precincts, all right, let's move on here. I already covered this, you're sequestered, you cannot leave. The workers also cannot use cell phones. I do allow the chair to have a cell phone so they can contact me during the day if they do have questions. But you can't have your cell phone out just browsing and using it and texting, even if there's downtime. So bring a book, bring a magazine, bring a word search, bring a crossword. Your cell phone will not be available for free time if you have it. And other things to consider for an AV board: make sure that your room is not a room that the public or people who inhabit the building would normally routinely enter, unless you can lock the door, because you don't want public just happening to go in, like a custodian or someone that goes through that room to get to the outside because their car is parked closer, something like that. You need to be able to secure the room, lock it if possible, and make sure it's not a room that is typically a high use room during the day. You want to make sure that your room has adequate space for tables, for processing the ballots, for storing the ballots, for the tabulator, a separate table if people want to bring in food. It needs to have decent and adequate space so it doesn't get too stuffy. It gets very uncomfortable if the room is not adequately spaced for the day. You also need to allow for facilities for restrooms. Now, granted, not all jurisdictions are going to have access to a room that meets all these requirements and has restrooms in the room where people don't have to leave. If you can find such a room, fantastic. I am lucky. I have access to such a room where my board doesn't have to leave to have access to facilities and restrooms. But if you do not, then you need to find a room that is as near as possible to restrooms, so that when your workers are leaving that room to use the restroom, they are not having to walk down a long hallway or through another room, or you don't want to increase the likelihood of them interacting with someone else, stopping to talk with someone else. You want that trip to be very short, very close, very quick. And if that is your situation, make sure that the voters or the workers rather, are well informed. Make it just no bones about it that they cannot interact with anyone when they leave to use the restroom. Excuse me. It's very, very important. So some general supplies that you're going to need for the board. You'll need the ballot envelopes, the applications from the voters, a poll book, some extra secrecy sleeves, just in case a voter returned their ballot without a secrecy sleeve. You'll need some blank ballots for duplication. You'll need your tabulators. The clerk will provide a printed list of absent voters from the voter database. And you'll just need some general office supplies, some pens, some notepads, paper clips, a letter opener, some rubber bands. Some clerks are purchasing like electric letter openers rather than individual handheld letter openers. I highly recommend that. It makes the process much easier, and it's easier to avoid ripped ballots that way, especially if you take the time to tamp down the ballots so that when they feed in, the ballot is as far down in the envelope as possible. The absent voter counting boards are processing many more ballots than they have before 2018. I know the list in Grand Ledge has gone from less than 600 to more than 2,000. We have far more than tripled, almost quadrupled our absent voter numbers, and most jurisdictions are seeing those same increases. So the idea of processing all those ballots in a normal precinct on election day while the voters are in there is becoming less and less realistic. In my mind, from a main point of view of the voters watching workers feed ballots into a machine, I just think the optics of that in today's society are not good. Voters need to be more comfortable and confident in the voting process, not less so by seeing workers, quote unquote, stuffing the ballot box in their mind. They don't know what's going on. They don't know those are official ballots. They just see the workers feeding ballots and don't know what's going on. So I highly, highly recommend AV counting boards just for that reason alone. And secondly, just because the volume is getting so big, the ability to do it during the day becomes less and less realistic. So the processing of the voters' ballots in the AV board can begin at any time after the polls have closed. I should have been a little more specific on that slide. It has to be 7 a.m. or later. They can't start before the polls open because they are, as I said before, they are a precinct just like any other precinct. So they can't open before 7. So at 7 o'clock, they can convene and start their work, and they can work all day. If you anticipate a lower number of ballots to process, you don't think you're going to need the full 13-hour day, you can start later. I used to start later before 2018 and the passage of Proposal 3. Now we start pretty much the same time as the precincts. We've been starting at 8 just to give a little bit of a break for me so I can be at the precincts and at the AV board when they open, but we'll see if we can continue that. So you need to allow for time to duplicate those ballots. They can be done right there as needed. You just need to make sure you have the space and the supplies to do so. And the AV board can process multiple precincts. You don't have to have an individual board for every precinct that you have. So Grand Ledge has 4 normal precincts. We have 1 AV board that processes the AV ballots from all 4 of those precincts. The poll book is split into 4 sections, so it's easy to keep track. And we've been doing that for years, for decades, really. We've had an AV counting board since the 50s, and it's worked out very well. So I don't know if we really covered anything that's going to have questions in that section. Let's just get into the actual processing. So when the AV board convenes, just like in the precincts, the very first thing you do is take your oath of office. You cannot do anything until you take that oath of office. It is the very first thing you must do. It may be that the chair has taken their oath prior and can administer the oath to the workers that are there, or it may be that the clerk is there with you and will administer the oath to everyone at the same time, including the chair. The next thing you do before you do anything else, verify the serial and the seal numbers on the tabulator match the numbers that the clerk has put in the poll book. If they don't match, then you can't do anything. They need to match, just like in the precinct. If they do, then you can turn on the tabulator, you can open it, you can sign the printout and get going just like in the normal precinct. Any issues with any of that would be just like in a normal precinct. You'd need to call the clerk and find out what's going on, why the numbers don't match, why the tabulator is not turning on, all that kind of stuff. So there's basically four steps to the day. You'll open the envelopes. You will process the removed ballots. Sorry, I should say removed ballots. I didn't catch that. You'll feed the ballots into the tabulator, and then you'll fill out the poll book at the end of the day. So the first step, opening the ballots, like I said, you'll need either a commercial letter opener or individual letter openers. Either way, take the time. It is well worth it. Take the time to grab 5 or 10 or a dozen envelopes at a time and tamp them down so those ballots are as far down in that envelope as you can before you open it. Taking that time to do it and avoiding cutting a ballot is well worth the time. You don't want cut ballots. It just makes more work for you later on. So when you're opening the envelopes, there's 3 steps to follow. It's a simple process. It's you check, and then you open, and then you remove. So you check the signature on the envelope and the clerk approval on the envelope. It's in 2 different spots, up in the corner and then down in the main part of the envelope. You're checking for the signature of the voter, and you're checking that the clerk verified that signature, and they should have a signature, or an initial rather, right here on the envelope. There should be a return date. The precinct and the ballot number may or may not be filled out. That's not important. That's on the label on the other side. The more important thing is that there's a return date and there's an initial that they did check the signature. They may or may not have checked this box. We are not. I think it's a little cumbersome. It's never been there before. I don't know why it's there now. If you initial it, you've verified the signature. I think it's an extra step that just slows down my front office staff. So we're not doing that. So the main thing to look for is the date it was returned, the initial that they verified the signature, and that the signature exists. Once you verify those, you can open the envelope and then compare the number on the ballot stub with the number on the envelope. Now, recognize we have not yet removed the ballot from the envelope. The ballot is still inside the secrecy sleeve, inside the envelope. And this is important because if you remove it from the envelope before you've confirmed that number, you're increasing the likelihood that either the envelope or the ballot will become mixed up in what's on the table, and you won't be able to verify. So you want to verify those numbers while the ballot is still inside the envelope. So you can open the envelope if the ballot is in there properly, which 99% of the time it will be. It is rare that it happens, but it does happen that the voter has put it in the wrong way, and you can pull it out far enough to figure out where the number is. But more often than not, the number will be right there at the top. You can verify that number matches the number on the envelope. If they match, then you can pull the secrecy sleeve and the ballot out and remove the stub. Now, please note that you are not removing the ballot from the secrecy sleeve. The ballot must remain inside the secrecy sleeve during this step, because at this time, you still know whose ballot this is. You still have the envelope in your hand. You could look and see how the person voted. So in order to maintain that voter's ballot secrecy, you need to leave that ballot inside the secrecy sleeve when you're taking it out of the envelope. Now, there is a chance that the voter did not include the secrecy sleeve, that they didn't put their ballot back in there. That's why the clerk should provide extra secrecy sleeves for you, so you can take one and, as best you can, turn your head or whatever and put that ballot in a secrecy sleeve when you take it out. The process does rely on the worker having some integrity. We are not there for the purpose of exposing votes. We're not there to find out how our neighbors voted. We're there to securely and secretly count the vote. And if you have workers with integrity, you won't have to worry about it, and you won't have to deal with any issues. So that's just something to keep in mind. But for all, at the most, try as hard as you can. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. Try as hard as you can to maintain that ballot secrecy, and don't expose those votes when you're taking the ballot out of the envelope. The other reason that you don't want to just take the ballot out real quick, when you're opening that ballot, or the envelope, you want to open that envelope and make sure there's actually a ballot in there. The voter may have unintentionally returned their envelope without the ballot, and you need to make a note of that, because the clerk has included that ballot in their number. So if there's no ballot to go into the tabulator, your numbers are going to be off, and you need to be able to make a note of that. And if you're moving too quickly, you're not going to catch all of those. So one of my golden rules for the AV board, I tell them every election, I would rather be accurate and slow than fast and inaccurate. I don't care if it takes them 12 hours to process the ballots if I know they've done it correctly. I'm not impressed with 5 hours of work if at the end of the day the work isn't good. They wasted their time. So move slow, move deliberately, Make sure that you're catching all the mistakes that you can possibly catch. And that is one at this point that you could catch, is the fact that there's no ballot in there. We'll cover a couple of others in a minute. So once you have pulled those secrecy sleeves out that have the ballots in them, your clerk may instruct you to group them however they see fit, or maybe the chair. But you want to group them somehow, either in groups of 10, in groups of 25, something that's easy to count and easy to verify that you have the number of ballots that the clerk says you're supposed to have. I find it easiest to group them in groups of 10, just for easy to count, easy to stack. 25 gets a little cumbersome when you're trying to stack them. So you group them in groups of 10, and you can sort of stack them perpendicular to each other. Make an X out of them, plus sign out of them as you're stacking them, and then you'll know what's going on. So at this point, the ballots are still inside the secrecy sleeves, and you want to keep some envelopes back. Don't open all the envelopes the clerk delivers in the morning, because throughout election day, more ballots will come in. And if only one or two come in, you don't want just those one or two at the end of the day, because it's going to be harder to maintain that ballot secrecy if you only have one or two ballots to process. So keep a half a dozen or so to process at the end of the day with the ballots that come in throughout the day. That way you have enough to maintain that ballot secrecy at the end of the day when things are done and you're wrapping up. So there's a couple of issues that you're going to run into at this point. We already talked about there being no ballot. If there is no ballot and you verified that envelope is empty, call the chair over. The chair will set it aside. They'll make a mark on the list of voters the chair has given you that ballot, the envelope was empty. You'll make a remark in the poll book remark section. You don't have to put the voter's name. You just have to say one envelope received without a ballot. And then the clerk will reject that ballot in the QVF so that we have a proper recording of what happened. There's also the possibility that there could be two ballots in one envelope. A lot of times people try to save postage by putting both spouses' envelopes in one ballot, or they may have just done it incorrectly. So the first thing to do if you open up that envelope and you notice there's two ballots is to verify whether one of them is in fact the correct ballot for that envelope. Chances are one of them will be. So that is the one that you will remove, verify the number, remove the stub, and set that aside. The second one is the one that you will give to the chair to give to the clerk to reject. Although the voter returned that ballot, they did not return it in a way that we can verify through their signature that they voted it and they are returning it. What we don't want to have happen is two ballots go to the same house, one person votes them both and puts them in one envelope to return. We want to make sure that the voter who requested the ballot has the opportunity to vote that ballot and return that ballot. So if there are two in an envelope, chances are one of them will be the correct one and you can process that one. The second one will not. So you'll have to set that aside. Now, let's say the third one. There also may be a damaged ballot. So if it's, and you can sort of tell when you open it, if it looks a little crumpled, if it looks like they wadded it up, maybe you can see a coffee stain on it right then and there. You can clearly see that it's damaged. You can set that aside. You don't take the ballot out to look for damage. Just if you happen to notice it easily at this step, go ahead and set it aside for duplication. Most of the damaged ballots you will find and address in the next step. So please keep in mind, any ballots you set aside for the clerk to reject must have their stubs. Don't take the stubs off. We need to know what ballot that is so we can reject it in the QVF. The only stubs that are removed are the stubs of ballots that you have verified they are correct, they were in the right envelope, and they were returned properly. The ones that are set aside, you want to leave those stubs on. So let's see if there's any questions at this point. Or do we have one more? No, there's one more slide. I'm sorry. So a couple of other issues that might pop up. When you open up that envelope, you may notice that the stub has already been removed. The voter didn't follow the instructions properly, or they assumed, or it came off, accidentally. Whatever the reason, it doesn't matter. If the stub has already been removed, that ballot must be processed as a challenged ballot. There's a challenge procedure that your clerk can provide to you. The Secretary of State provides that to us, so we can provide it to you. And you can follow that process, but you must do it if the stub has been detached before you do, if the voter has detached it. Another issue is the ballot that is in the envelope doesn't match the number that's on the envelope. This can happen if two ballots are sent to the same household and they get mixed up a little bit. One person returns the other person's ballot and vice versa. So the first thing to do is to look for the other envelope to that household. You can find that on the list of voters. You can see if someone at the same household also received a ballot. You can call the clerk and say, hey, we've got this envelope, John Smith, but the ballot number doesn't match, and the clerk can verify, yes, his wife received that ballot, here's her name, look for her envelope, and chances are his ballot will be in her envelope. If that's the case, then it's fine. You verify that the two ballot numbers are correct, even though they may not have been returned in the right envelope, they are still the same numbers that were sent, and so you process them normal. There's no challenge, no weird process at all. That's fine. But if they don't match, if you can't find someone in the same household, and there's just no reason why that ballot number would be different, then it cannot be processed. It has to be rejected. So if in the same frame, if the stub was detached and the number doesn't match, then it also can't be processed. So contact the clerk. And that's the rule in any case. If the numbers don't match, then the ballot cannot be processed, whether the stub's attached or not. So we're at the end of this process. Does anybody have any questions about opening the ballots, verifying the numbers, dealing with any of the issues that we've talked about in the last couple of minutes? I don't see anybody. Okay. And I'm sorry if I'm going, I hope I'm not going too fast. I'm trying to regulate my speed. I tend to talk a little fast, so I'm trying to slow down consciously. So the next step, after you have opened the envelopes, you've verified that the ballot number matches the number on the envelope, you've removed the stub, and you've set those ballots inside the secrecy sleeves, you've set those aside for processing. Now we're at the next step. Now we can remove those ballots from the secrecy sleeve, because at this point we have a stack of hundreds of ballots, most likely. We have no idea whose is whose. We can pull those ballots out and expose the votes because we don't know whose they are. We're no longer exposing anyone's vote because we don't know whose vote it is. So you can go ahead and take the ballots out. You can flatten them. You can count them again. It's always a good idea to count them again. Make sure that you have the number that you expect to have before you put them in the tabulator. The secrecy sleeve should be set aside. Don't throw them away. They are reusable and it will save the clerk some money. So please don't throw them away. Let the clerk decide whether they've been used or used to the point where they can't be reused again. Just set them aside for the clerk to pick up again. So once you've flattened them, you've organized them, you know how many ballots you have It is the number that you expected. You want to make sure that once you've organized them and you've recounted them, if the list that the clerk gave you says you should have 100 ballots, you set aside 10 to wait until the end of the day, so you have 90 envelopes. You've opened those envelopes. They all had ballots in them. They all verified, so you have 90 ballots. Once you've verified that, now you can start putting them into the tabulator. If you don't have the number of ballots you expected, now is the time to go back through those envelopes and see if you've missed something. See if you left a ballot in an envelope. See if you forgot to account for a ballot you set aside to be rejected because the numbers didn't match. Make sure you have the number you expect to have before you start feeding them into the tabulator. Because once you start feeding them into the tabulator, it is much more difficult to make corrections. You want to be able to make corrections and figure out what's happening before you start tabulating them. So once you have the number you expect to have, like we said before, a team of 2 inspectors of different political parties can feed those ballots into the tabulator. It probably goes without saying to feed them in one at a time, but I put that in there to remind you that when you're going through a stack of ballots, it is pretty easy to grab 2 at a time. So just make sure you're being, again, slow and methodical. Make sure that you're not rushing. Make sure you're taking your time, feeding those ballots in one at a time, waiting for the ballot to fully enter the tabulator, for the tabulator to fully scan it and recognize it and put it in the ballot box, and it will prompt you with that flag that says it's done, the vote was counted, and then you know it's time, you can put the next ballot in. It may give you an error. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but more often than not, hopefully, it will just go in. If it does give you an error, tell it, don't override that error. Don't say accept anyway. Always hit return, get that ballot back every single time and look at it and figure out what's going on. Maybe the person overvoted, maybe they undervoted, maybe it's completely blank and they just wanted a record of them participating in that election, but they didn't really feel like voting for anyone. Figure out what's going on. If it is an overvote and there are no corrective marks, meaning the voter has not clearly crossed off one vote and filled in an oval or a rectangle with another vote, if it's not clear that they've made a correction, then if it's just a standard overvote, they filled in 2 boxes and they can only fill in 1, or they undervoted where one office is blank and one is not, or the ballot is blank. If there's no reason to think the voter made a correction of some kind, then you can put that ballot back in the tabulator and override the error, and the tabulator will count what it can and it will ignore what it has to. If there is an issue where there's an ambiguous mark or the voter has written on it, no, not this one, and marked another, another candidate, absent voters make all sorts of corrections on their ballots, then that's when you'll need to duplicate it. There are processes for that. There are regulations where a mark is deemed acceptable or not acceptable. The clerk can provide you with that documentation from the Secretary of State. It's not a matter of judgment. There are clear guidelines from the Secretary of State about what marks are valid and what marks are not, and what corrective marks are valid and what corrective marks are not. So it's not a judgment call for you to make. You just follow the procedures and you'll be fine. So the duplication process is, like we said before, again, something that has to be done by 2 workers from different political parties. These marking standards are the acceptable marking standards. Basically, there needs to be a mark, a line within the voting area. It can't be outside. If they wrote the word yes next to the oval or the box, it does not count. It must be inside the box. It can be both inside and outside, but it can't be only outside. So if they make an X outside, or if they write the word yes outside, or a check mark outside, it doesn't count. Some part of that mark needs to be inside the box, preferably fully inside the box. But it can go out the box as long as part of it is within. So if you see a mark, let's say a check mark, they checked one box, and then they drew an X through that, and then checked another box. If the two checks are consistent, they look the same, it's the same method of marking, then that is a valid correction. If one of them is a check and one of them is completely filled in, that is not consistent marking, and you cannot consider that a corrective action. The promulgated rules from the Secretary of State are very clear that the corrective action must be consistent with valid markings elsewhere on the ballot. They can't be different. And that is to protect the voter from someone else having access to their ballot and making changes without the voter's knowledge. So you want to make sure that the markings that are there are consistent. If you have received federal write-in absent ballots or military and overseas voter ballots, those must be duplicated. They are not of a format that can be put through the tabulator. You must duplicate those ballots. So a duplicated ballot, the process, the clerk will provide blank ballot stock for you. So you will have two ballots. You will write on the original ballot, original 1. And then you'll write on the duplicated ballot, duplicate 1. And then the team of 2 workers will transfer by hand the valid votes from the original ballot to the duplicated ballot, ignoring, not ignoring, but not carrying over the corrective marks. So if someone did fill in a box for Jane Smith and then drew an X or wrote the word no and then had the same consistent marking in the candidate below Jane Smith, you would only duplicate the vote for the candidate below Jane Smith. The voter clearly wanted to make that correction. The marks were consistent, the correction was clear, so you can duplicate that. And then when you feed that ballot in, it will not reject it as an overvote, it will just accept it. All the other votes are also duplicated as they appear on the ballot. If there's just one race that has a correction in it, all the other races on that ballot are duplicated as they are. So you want that ballot to look exactly the same, just without the corrective marks. So if the machine rejected the ballot because of ambiguous marks, meaning the voter might have spilled something or might have inadvertently made a mark where there wasn't a voter or a candidate rather to vote for, and the machine picked that up somehow, you would have to duplicate that ballot without those ambiguous marks, so that the voter's vote is just what they voted for and doesn't have those ambiguous extraneous marks on it. So the duplicating process can be a little cumbersome, especially on a primary where people are going to possibly vote for multiple parties and then realize they can't and make corrections so that only one party receives their vote. You'll have to duplicate those ballots so that they are correct and only one party receives votes, and the machine will take it. hopefully people will either ask for a new ballot from the clerk rather than making corrections on the ballot they have. But it's likely that they would just make a correction and return it. So you'll have to do that duplicating. There's an envelope to put in the ballots that the original ballots you've duplicated, and the clerk will get those. Actually, no, I'm sorry. That envelope goes with the ballots at the end of the day. So if the precinct gets recounted, whoever is recounting it can see those original ballots. They can see the duplicated ballots because you've written on it duplicate 1 or duplicate 2 or duplicate 3, however many you've had to do, and they can look at that and make sure that the duplication was proper and the vote was counted properly. So at the end of the day, make sure that you put those original ballots with all of the other ballots in the ballot bag. That was kind of a lot. Does anybody have any questions about duplicating ballots? I know Linda had a question. Hopefully that answered her question on that. I'll wait just a second to see if anybody has any questions. I don't see any. All right, well, that's good. Hopefully I covered it adequately. And I'm sure your clerk can clear things up for you as well if you do think of something later. So at the end of the day, we kind of glossed over the rest of the day. Other than duplicating ballots, there really shouldn't be any other issues with the tabulator. You're basically just spending time feeding ballots into the tabulator. A vast majority of them will just go in without issue. The machine won't tell you there's a problem. If there is, you'll reject it, you'll look at it, and you'll see, oh, well, they overvoted, but they didn't make any corrections, so we have to accept this ballot as the voter voted it. And you feed it back in and hit accept and move on to the next ballot. If you are processing multiple precincts in the same absent voter counting board, you must feed them separately. You don't want to mix precinct ballots into the tabulator. And I say this because it's the only way to make sure each precinct has been processed properly. So if precinct 1, you expect 100 ballots, you feed precinct 1 into the tabulator, you have 100 ballots, it shows you that, you know you're good, and you can move on to precinct 2. Precinct 2 has 75 ballots. You put precinct 2's ballots in there, and now you only have 174 instead of 175. Well, now you know the problem is precinct 2. You don't have to double check precinct 1 because you know it balanced. But if you flip back and forth between precinct 1 and precinct 2 as you're feeding ballots into the tabulator, you'll have no idea which precinct has the problem at the end of the day. So if you're doing multiple precincts, compartmentalize. Process an entire precinct start to finish before you move on to the next one, so that you know you're balanced and you know if there is a problem, what precinct has that problem, and you don't have to waste time searching through multiple precincts. So at the end of the day, you have fed your ballots into the machine, you're balanced, your numbers are all good. If there are any inconsistencies, you've marked those in the remarks section, like an envelope with no ballot, an envelope with 2 ballots, that sort of thing. You want to contact the clerk. They should voluntarily come to you at 8 o'clock with any extra ballots, but if they haven't shown up, give them a few minutes. They're a little busy, but go ahead and call them and ask them, hey, are you going to be delivering any additional ballot envelopes? If the answer is yes, wait for them. You can process them with the ones that you've held aside. If the answer is no, then you can go ahead and process those ballots you've held aside. Again, do them in batches per the precinct. Don't mix them together even now. And it's always a good idea to keep back the same number so that if the clerk doesn't deliver any additional ballots, then well, we held back 5, or we held back 10, we know how many to expect. Once you've processed those additional ballots, then you can compare. The clerk should also provide an updated list of voters, because throughout the day, if people have been bringing absent voter ballots to the clerk's office or to the polls, those will be delivered to the clerk's office for the clerk to enter into QVF, so they can provide you with an updated voter list that includes the additional envelopes that they'll be delivering to you. So you may receive an updated voter list, so you'll need to make sure you're comparing the proper numbers. If you do receive an updated voter list, make sure you write on the first list from the beginning of the day, old, or first list, or somehow mark it so that you don't inadvertently put that in the poll book. You want to make sure you put the most up-to-date list in the poll book. So you compare the number on the tabulator with the number of voters on the list that the clerk gives you. Those numbers should match, taking into account if you did have envelopes with no ballots, then those numbers won't match, but you'll have that in the remarks, and that's a perfectly acceptable reason for the discrepancy, and it remains a recountable precinct. If you cannot explain why the numbers are different, then we have a problem. But those numbers should match if everything has gone smoothly and you've been able to account for all your ballots. If those numbers do match, then you can close the polls on the tabulator just like you do in a normal precinct, sign the reports. The only difference is in the AV board, only the workers who actually fed ballots into the tabulator need to sign the reports at the end of the day from the tabulator. And the reason this is a little beneficial is if you're processing multiple precincts, you've got 2, 3, 4 precincts in your AV board. That means you probably have a dozen or so workers, but you've only got 2 of them who actually need to sign the reports at the end of the day, because only 2 of them fed ballots into that machine. So that's one nice thing that might save you just a little bit of time and confusion. So there's 2 issues that you might run into. If the tabulator number is larger than the list of voters the clerk gave you, meaning you have too many ballots, then you need to make sure that all of the ballots are listed on that voter list. And unfortunately, the only way to make sure of that is to go through them one by one. So you will have to sit down with the list of voters and your envelopes and mark them off. Yep, we found John's, we found Barbara's, we found Janice's. It's a cumbersome process, but it is unfortunately the only solution. And you'll have to find the 1 or 2 voters who are included on that list, but you don't have an envelope for. And the reason this may happen is the QVF may have received an envelope incorrectly. It's possible that the clerk or the secretary, whoever is processing those voters, clicked the wrong button and didn't undo it. So the list contains a voter that should not have been included because they did not return their ballot. So it's unlikely to happen. The second option is much more likely to happen, that the tabulator number is lower than the number of voters on the list, meaning you have too few ballots in the tabulator. So you received 100 envelopes and you only have 99 ballots. The solution to that is you had an envelope without a ballot, and it's too late for that now because all your envelopes are empty. The only time that you can confidently say that you received an envelope without a ballot is when you are opening those envelopes. And if you have not made a remark at that time, it is too late. You cannot make a remark at the end of the day that you received an envelope without a ballot. It's not verifiable. And the canvassing board cannot rely on that as a legitimate reason. So that's yet another reason to be slow and deliberate when you're opening those envelopes, because if that is going to happen, you want to find it. You want to catch it then. The solution is to verify that all the rejected ballots were recorded properly, all the duplicated ballots were processed properly, and hand count the ballots to make sure that you have 100 ballots. That if the tabulator only shows 99 and you hand count 100 pieces of paper, well, the tabulator didn't do it right. You're going to have to call the clerk. The clerk will have to reset that tabulator, and you'll have to feed all the ballots again as if it is the beginning of the day. Do not do that yourself. That is something that the county clerk or the local clerk will have to make the decision on. The Secretary of State does not like that to happen. They will tell you, do not do that. They don't consider it a valid solution. So it's not something that you should do without a lot of people saying, yes, it's okay. So yeah, both of these situations, if the number is greater or the number is lower, neither one of them is a good thing. It means throughout the day, the workers were not keeping on top of things. Something wrong happened and wasn't caught. Either an envelope was empty and wasn't caught, an envelope had 2 ballots and wasn't caught, there's a voter on the list that shouldn't be there. If you're moving slowly, methodically, you should be able to catch all of these errors, and at the end of the day, your numbers will balance just like they would in a precinct. I don't want to sound as though this is a common occurrence. It is not common. We have, in our absent voter counting board, we balance every time. But I drill into my workers to be slow and methodical and catch things as they happen, not at the end of the day. So, okay, the poll book. This is more for the chairs that may be in attendance with us tonight, but it's something good for all the workers to be aware of. On the front page of the poll book, you want to make sure that the total number of voters is recorded in that top corner, that all of the challenged voters and challenge processes are properly recorded. If there is a challenger, then there are processes to follow. You have to indicate the time, the challenger's name, the name of the voter that was challenged. Obviously, you can't put down the voter's phone number because this isn't the precinct. You don't have access to the voter, but you can put down the voter's address, the reason for the challenge, and then process that ballot as a challenged ballot. I guess we could cover that real quickly now. If you do happen to need to challenge a ballot, the stub was removed by the voter, or there's some other issue with the ballot, or there's a challenger in the AV board, the number of that ballot needs to be written in pencil on the ballot and then obscured with a piece of paper and tape. And then that ballot is fed into the machine as normal. And that is done so that if the challenge process turns up to be true later, that ballot can be found and the votes reversed out of the election. So when you are covering that ballot number with a piece of paper and the tape, you want to do so in such a way that the tape is running in the same orientation as the ballot will feed into the tabulator. So you don't want to put that tape across the ballot and then feed it in and have those rollers grab the edge of that tape. You want to make the tape in line with the ballot so that as it feeds into the machine, the rollers just roll right over it and don't grab it. So hopefully you won't have a lot of that. The challenge process in the AV board is very rare. If there are write-ins, you want to make sure that you have tallied those properly. The HART equipment that we use in Eaton County has a write-in report. You do not need to look at each individual ballot. There's a write-in report that will print out, and you only need to print it if there are valid write-in candidates, as the local clerk has told you. If the clerk does not provide you a list of valid write-in candidates, you can completely ignore the write-in report and any ballots that have write-in candidates on them. The only time you need to pay attention to that is if the clerk has given you a list of valid write-in candidates. If there are, you need to make sure that they are tallied properly. If they are not, you must write the word none across this sheet. Do not leave the write-in sheet blank. The Board of Canvassers wants to know whether or not there were candidates to count. And if there weren't, they need to know there are none. If you leave it blank, then they don't know. And you need to tell them for sure one way or the other. The last page of the poll book, the best advice is to just fill everything in. Check every box, fill every box, sign every line. Don't leave anything blank. If you don't need all of the seal number boxes, use the ones you need and draw a line through the ones you don't, so that it's clear only one or only two seals were used. Again, the Board of Canvassers is much more appreciative of information than non-information. So if the box is completely blank, they don't know if a seal was used and not recorded, or if no seal was used. But if you draw a line through it, then they know for certain no seal was used. So it's always better to provide information than to not. The inspectors that are present at the close of the polls must sign the back of this. In this instance, it is everyone, not just the inspectors that fed ballots into the machine. That rule is only for the reports from the tabulator. Every inspector must sign the poll book. The envelopes are fairly easy. They include instructions of what should go in them, and they are color coded. So the poll book goes in envelope number 1. The red pages from the poll book go in envelope number 2. The green pages go in the green envelope number 3. And as I mentioned earlier, any ballots you've duplicated, the originals need to go in this envelope and be placed with the ballots in the ballot bag. If you have any spoiled or defective ballots, for the AV board, those would be duplicated. So those would be in the duplicated envelope. The spoiled and defective ballot envelope really should be empty, because if you do have one, it should have been duplicated. So if you are doing multiple precincts in the same AV board, make sure you separate the precincts in the ballot bag, either by large rubber bands around each precinct's ballots. If there's too many, then rubber band them in smaller sections. Just somehow, so that even if precinct 1 has 3 bundles of rubber banded ballots and precinct 2 also has 3 bundles, it just keep them from intermixing in the ballot bag, because when we do a recount, it's likely that we will only need to recount one of the precincts in the AV board. And if the ballots in the ballot bag are all loose and intermingled and shaken up, we can't separate them. They don't have any numbers at that point. Yes, they have a title on the ballot that says what precinct they're from, but it makes it far, far more cumbersome to recount that board and that precinct than it would be otherwise. And it's so easy for you at this point to do so because you have them all separated anyway. So if the clerk has not provided you with any large rubber bands, you can also do it by using blank pieces of paper, or the best thing to do is just call your clerk and say, hey, can you get us some big rubber bands? It really, over the years, we found that's the easiest way to do it. Makes it simple, makes it easy to stack them in there. So There are some training resources available for you on the Secretary of State's website. There's videos they have up there about absent voter counting boards, precinct work in general, poll work in general. There's stuff about challengers, all sorts of things. So I recommend you go to that website, YouTube, and see if you can find something that's applicable and will help you understand a little more what's going on if you do have any questions. So that's all I have for the evening. Does anyone have any questions or concerns that they want to raise at this point? I'm more than happy to answer any questions anybody has.
Hey, Gregory, can I say something real quick?
Yeah, go ahead, Kim.
Just for everybody that's logged on, if you, like Dawn, if you have some workers that are there, just email Diana or you can email me the list of people that attended this. So if there's multiple people signed on, I need those names, please. That's it.
Okay. Well, I don't see anyone raising their hand. Hopefully people aren't trying to and having difficulty doing it. I would hate for that to happen and have their questions not answered. Please, if anybody wants, let me back it up. There's my email address, my office number, my cell number. If you have any questions, please give me a call, send me an email. I'm more than happy to talk to anybody, explain anything that you may have questions on. Oh, we do have a couple of people raising their hands now. Okay, hold on. See if I can get this to work. I'm trying to unmute it, but it won't unmute. There it goes. Okay. Go ahead, Linda. What's your question?
I know this is just for Grand Ledge, but, or maybe not. Okay, so we have 4 precincts in Grand Ledge and we feed all one precinct in first. Do we open the ballot box at that point and rubber band everything and then start feeding in precinct 2?
Yes, thank you. That is an excellent point.
Okay.
I can't believe I glossed over that. Yes.
Okay.
If you have multiple precincts, as you feed the ballots into the tabulator, you can have the ballot box open the whole time if you want.
Okay.
And you can have another worker there, a third worker, sort of, organizing those ballots as they fall, or you can wait. I mean, it holds, thousands of ballots.
Right.
But yes, once you're done with a precinct, get those ballots out of that box. If your numbers match, you're good. Bundle them up, set them off to the side, and get the second precinct started.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. We've got somebody else here. Hopefully this will work. I don't know why it takes 2 clicks to unmute people. Oh. Okay, there we go. Dawn, what's your question?
Okay, so it may be kind of an off-the-wall question, but back to like the challengers that are going to be in the poll.
Yeah.
How is that going to work since they can be like standing right next to you looking over your shoulder with everything going on with COVID? How are they going to handle that so that people aren't getting upset?
Yeah, well, the clerks can require the election workers to wear masks because they're employees. It's not, you can require your workers wear masks. The challengers, I don't know that we can require they wear masks or face shields. We can certainly strongly request it and recommend it. But as with the voters, we cannot require voters or challengers or poll watchers to wear masks or face shields. It's only a recommendation. It's not the law. So if they don't want to, then they don't have to.
Okay.
And there's really not much more we can do than to look at them and say, look, we are doing our best to protect our voters by wearing masks. Would you please wear a mask while you are behind this table? And if they can look at you in the eye and say no, well then I guess they don't have to.
Okay. And yeah, because it's going to be hard for them to follow the social distancing and everything. And I was just kind of curious, you know, if you could actually say, can you please put a mask on? We'd appreciate it.
Right, right. And actually that brings up one thing I did want to cover. I'm looking over my notes now and seeing it as we're talking. The efforts that your clerk may do in the AV board. Granted, there are no voters there. But there's still a need to have some protection. Granted, the work that we're doing in the AV board is a little closer than in the polls. You know, it's two people working together to feed the ballots. It's you know, people sitting at a table opening envelopes. You know, hopefully you can find a room and some tables large enough to space people out while you're opening envelopes. The people that are feeding the ballots into the machine, obviously, they're going to have to be a little closer than 6 feet. I mean, the ballot box is only, you know, 2.5 feet square. So I would highly recommend that the two voters that are feeding ballots into the machine, at minimum, wear face masks. If you can also get face shields, I know the Secretary of State is intending to provide those. So if you can get those two workers to wear face shields as well, that's probably a very good idea. The Secretary of State is also going to be providing hand sanitizer, gloves. The workers are more than welcome to use that. I highly, highly strongly recommend your workers do not use hand sanitizer while they're handling ballots. It will get the ballots to swell, and they may jam in the machine. So if they want to use hand sanitizer, it's something to use as they're preparing to do ballots. Make sure that when they have used it, it is fully evaporated from their hands are dry, and then they can start doing ballots. It's not something to use during that process. You know, yes, workers are going to be touching ballots and setting them aside, and then other workers are going to be touching those ballots and feeding them into a machine. If the workers are adequately washing their hands, they're using the hand sanitizer properly, they're wearing masks so that they're not breathing on their hands, the risk is minimized as much as we can possibly make it for that day. You know, I don't know about the rest of you, but I have handled cash between myself and a store clerk. I've handled receipts between myself and a store clerk. So it's not as though handling ballots back and forth is something new that no one is doing outside of an AV board. We are routinely handling paper back and forth between people. The strongest advice is still to wash your hands, wear a mask, don't touch your face. And if we can get the workers to follow those rules in the AV room, everyone should be much safer and much healthier the next day. So does anyone else have any other questions on anything that we've talked about, or maybe something that we didn't cover that you're wondering about? Okay. Like I said, please feel free to give me a call, send me an email. I'm more than happy to talk and explain things. But with that, I want to thank everybody for attending, and everyone have a good evening.